For most of history, you had to take a great general's word for it. Then, at the start of the last century, something changed. The government started sending cameras. The greatest military commanders of the film era did their thinking in front of a lens, and the reels are still in the vault, which means we can check. And when you check, the famous stories start to wobble. The most quoted line one of these men ever said was invented by a screenwriter, and the single most consequential order of the 20th century was spoken out loud in a room full of witnesses, and no two of them wrote down the same words. This is a file about 5 commanders, the decisions that were real, and the film that proves it. Let's open the file, starting at number 5. Number 5. The admiral who won the most important carrier battle in American history, without ever having commanded a carrier. Days before the American task forces sailed to intercept a Japanese fleet steaming toward Midway, Vice Admiral William Halsey was hospitalized with a severe skin condition. Asked to name his own replacement, Halsey pointed to his cruiser commander, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Not an aviator, not a carrier man, a quiet cruiser officer handed Task Force 16 on a sick man's recommendation, on the eve of the battle that would decide the Pacific War. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Spruance ordered the bombers of Enterprise and Hornet into the air at the extreme edge of their range, roughly 175 miles out, to hit the Japanese carriers before they could strike first. His instruction to the strike leader was 4 words long: proceed on mission assigned. By nightfall, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were gone, and the historian Samuel Eliot Morison would later call Spruance one of the greatest admirals in American naval history. The thing that stops you is what he did that night. With the enemy broken and running, Spruance turned his ships east, away from the chase. He would not risk his carriers in a night surface fight against Japanese battleships. Historians now credit that quiet withdrawal as much as the morning's attack. But 2 years later, the same instinct nearly ended him. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944, Spruance held his fleet close to the invasion beaches at Saipan instead of racing after the Japanese carriers. His pilots gutted Japan's carrier air arm in a single day. The fight their own ready rooms nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, though exactly who coined the phrase survives only in pilots' oral histories. Most of the enemy fleet escaped in the dark. The Navy's aviators wanted him relieved for it. Nimitz refused. So which was it? The same discipline that won Midway, mission over glory, or the caution that let a beaten fleet live to fight again? His own pilots never agreed. Neither do the historians. Number 4, never had a doubt in his life he was willing to say out loud. His problem was everything else he said out loud. Number 4, the man who built American armor from an empty field in France and then nearly argued and slapped his way out of the war it was built for. In November 1917, Captain George Patton was ordered to organize the American Expeditionary Force's first light tank school at a village called Bourg. He had no tanks. The first 10 arrived in March 1918, and Patton personally taught the first crews. That September, he led the first American tank attack in history at Saint-Mihiel, and weeks later, in the Meuse-Argonne, he went forward on foot against machine guns near the village of Cheppy and was shot through the upper thigh. His orderly dragged him to safety and earned the Distinguished Service Cross doing it. The birth of American armor was brutal and short of everything. By early October, the brigade's operational tank count had fallen from 127 to 89. That forgotten month in 1918 is why, a war later, there was a Patton at all. One line, because the record requires it. In August 1943, in Sicily, Patton struck 2 hospitalized soldiers, one running a malarial fever, one suffering combat stress. Eisenhower's written rebuke and the forced apologies sidelined him from combat command for nearly a year and very nearly kept him out of the invasion of Europe entirely. What brought him back was what he could do that nobody else could. Third Army went operational under Patton on the 1st of August 1944 and covered roughly 400 miles across France in under a month. When the German counteroffensive struck the Ardennes that December, Patton told Eisenhower he could attack within 48 hours. The room was skeptical. He had quietly ordered the contingency planning a week earlier. Third Army then wheeled 90 degrees north, a turn many historians describe as the largest and fastest redirection of a field army in military history, and on December 26th, its lead tanks broke the encirclement at Bastogne. Days before the German attack, Patton had already ordered a weather prayer from his chaplain, printed for roughly 250,000 men, and when the skies cleared, he pinned a bronze star on the chaplain. It's believed to be the only medal of the war awarded for writing a prayer. The thing that stops you, the most famous thing Patton ever said on film, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book," was never said by Patton. A screenwriter invented it a quarter century after his death. The real record needed no script. The open question historians still argue is harder. How much of Third Army's dash belongs to Patton alone, and how much to the logistics and strategy of the men above him who kept forgiving him? Number 3, never raised his voice at all. He gave the Pacific War its entire shape in 15 quiet pages. Number 3, 10 days after Pearl Harbor, the president handed one man the wreckage of the Pacific Fleet. He took command standing on a submarine because there was nothing bigger left to stand on. On the last day of December 1941, Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz assumed command of the United States Pacific Fleet in a ceremony held on the deck of the submarine USS Grayling. The choice of venue was not symbolism. Every battleship at Pearl Harbor was sunk or damaged. The greatest military commanders are usually handed armies. Nimitz was handed a harbor full of salvage work and a promotion to full admiral effective the same day. 5 months later, with a Japanese fleet holding the carrier advantage and steaming for Midway, Nimitz wrote his 2 task force commanders a secret letter of instruction. In the last days of May 1942, he ordered Frank Jack Fletcher and Raymond Spruance to be, quote, governed by the principle of calculated risk. Do not expose your force to a superior enemy without, quote, good prospect of inflicting, as a result of such exposure, greater damage to the enemy. 15 pages, 1 principle, and then he did the hardest thing a theater commander can do. He trusted the men on the water to make the call themselves. What followed was a strategy, not a battle. From the Gilberts to the Marshalls to the Marianas, Nimitz's Central Pacific Offensive advanced by deliberately skipping Japan's strongest island fortresses, cutting them off from supply and letting them wither, rather than paying for them beach by beach. It ran in parallel and in constant creative tension, with MacArthur's separate campaign to the southwest. 2 roads across one ocean, and the argument over which one mattered more never really ended. The thing that stops you is the trust. The most consequential naval battle of the century was fought exactly the way a 15-page letter said it should be, by 2 subordinates free to decide, held to a single principle. So the open question historians still trade. Was Midway 1 in the intelligence shop at Pearl Harbor, where the code breakers found the date and the place, or on the flight decks 1,300 miles away? Nimitz's answer was to share the credit. History is still auditing the split. Number 2 trusted no one's judgment but his own. Once, at 70 years old, against every chart the Navy owned, he turned out to be right. Number 2, the general who came back. Twice. Once to a beach he had promised, and once to a country that could not decide whether to cheer him or fire him. It did both. In March 1942, under the president's direct order, Douglas MacArthur escaped the besieged Philippines by PT boat and from Australia made the promise that followed him the rest of his life. I shall return. He was named Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific Area that April. 2.5 years later, in October 1944, at 64 years old, he waded ashore at Leyte and announced, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The film of that walk through the surf exists because he understood, better than any commander of his generation, exactly what a camera was for. The record beside it is heavier. Of the men he had been ordered to leave behind in 1942, only about a third lived to hear that broadcast. His defining gamble came 6 years later in a different war. In August 1950, in Tokyo, a 70-year-old MacArthur argued for an amphibious landing at the Korean port of Inchon, and the men the Joint Chiefs sent to talk him out of it lined up to tell him why it could not work. A tidal range of roughly 30 feet that left the beaches usable only a few hours a day, high sea walls, and a single narrow approach channel. No recording of that meeting exists. The famous line about Inchon being a 5,000-to-1 gamble survives only in memoirs written afterward, and the Marine Corps' own historian wrote that we will never know exactly what the general said. What is not in dispute is what happened. On September 15, 1950, roughly 70,000 troops in 260 ships went ashore at Inchon. The port was secured within a day. One military historian calls it a brilliant success, almost flawlessly executed, and, in that same historian's words, the only unambiguously successful operation of its kind for the next 40 years. One line, stated carefully, 7 months later, in April 1951, President Truman relieved MacArthur of all his commands, stating that the general was, quote, unable to give his wholehearted support to the policies of the United States government and of the United Nations in matters pertaining to his official duties, after MacArthur repeatedly took his disagreements with Korea policy public. He came home to a ticker-tape parade and told Congress that old soldiers never die, they just fade away, a line he borrowed and said so from an old army ballad, "The thing that stops you." At 70, he was older than most of the men sent to talk him out of Inchon. The open question is the one the country split over at the time, and historians still split over now. Was his relief the necessary defense of civilian control over the military, or a policy argument that escalated until only one side could stay standing? Both readings still have serious defenders. Number 1, never led troops under fire in his life, which is exactly why he is number 1. Number 1. The largest invasion in history, decided by one man's word, on a weather forecast, and the strange truth that nobody, including the man himself, could ever agree on what the word was. Dwight Eisenhower's combat record before the Second World War was 7 days short of existing. In October 1918, he finally received orders to France, with departure set for November 18th. The war ended November 11th. He spent the First World War training tank crews in Pennsylvania, and by most accounts, George Marshall reached past hundreds of more senior officers to give him command anyway, first of the North Africa landings, and then, from January 1944, of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the largest coalition command yet assembled. His qualification was not battlefield glory. It was that Americans, Britons, Canadians, and Frenchmen who could barely stand each other would all take orders from him. The decision came at a country house near Portsmouth on the night of June 4, 1944. The invasion had already been postponed once on the word of his chief meteorologist. Now the forecast offered one narrow break in the weather. Go. And the largest amphibious force ever gathered would be committed beyond recall. Wait. And the tides would not align again for weeks. With every day raising the odds, the secret would break. In the small hours of June 5th, Eisenhower gave the order. And here, the record does something remarkable. At least 6 different phrasings of what he said survive from the people in that room. The tidy version everyone quotes traces to a historian's interview that, according to Eisenhower's own post-presidential records, could not have taken place on the day claimed. The National Archives itself has flagged the famous wording. The order was real. The words are folklore. What he put on paper is not. His order of the day, issued to the invasion force, is verified word for word. You are about to embark upon the great crusade, toward which we have striven these many months. And there was a second piece of paper, written for the other outcome, in case the landings failed. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. He misdated it July instead of June, crumpled it when the beaches held, and an aide fished it out of the wastebasket. That note sits on display in his presidential library in Abilene, Kansas. The thing that stops you, the one commander on this list who never personally fought a battle wrote, in advance and alone, the only unconditional acceptance of failure in this entire file. The open question historians still argue is the strategy that followed. Whether his broad front advance that autumn, holding the whole coalition line moving together instead of gambling on one concentrated thrust into Germany, lengthened the war, or was the only strategy a fragile alliance could survive. That's the file, top to bottom. 5 commands, 3 wars, and one thing none of the commanders before them ever had. The cameras were rolling, and the film survives the legend. 5 of the greatest military commanders ever filmed, and in every single file, the legend and the record disagree somewhere. That is not a flaw in the history. That is the reason the film matters. The reels outlast the retelling. That seals this file, but the vault runs deep, and the next one's already on my desk. If this case earned its place, drop a like. Subscribe to get clearance to every file we crack open. Ring the bell so the next one reaches you the second it's declassified. And leave a comment. Tell me what you make of this case and which one I should pull from the vault next. New file every week. This has been the Countdown Files. Stay curious. Case closed.